Hello, Spokane, and welcome to EvoReal Talks. I want to read you something. This is out of a CC&R document. CC&R stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. And if you're a homeowner, you know that CC&Rs can dictate things like the size of the house you can build, what you can park outside, even the color of paint that is on the exterior of your house. So let's read this. This is from a CC&R. No person of any race other than white or Caucasian
shall use or occupy any building or any lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant.
So, sorry.
Where do you think this CC&R existed or was written and recorded? Probably Alabama. If I told you it was in Alabama, would you believe me?
Yeah, I would.
Maybe South Carolina?
Something like that. Somewhere where blatant racism and systematic prevention of home ownership was surely, this had to be a Confederate state.
Where did you first read this actual deed restriction, Jessica?
All right. Sorry I'm emotional today, everybody.
Obviously, we're covering and tackling some pretty heavy and intense stuff.
So if you're thinking that it came from a Confederate state, you are wrong. 6 years ago, I was selling a relative's home in Shadle Park.
That's here in Spokane.
I received the title report, like I do with every house. And this quote was letter I of that CC&R. I could not believe what I was reading. I was disgusted, I was angered, and I was saddened that this clause was staring at me in black and white in my beloved city of Spokane. Today, we are going to be discussing and tackling housing and discrimination.
Obviously, you can sense that there's a heaviness with this episode, and I think it's highly timely and important. What we're jumping on is way bigger than we'll be able to completely cover in one radio or podcast episode. For me, one of my greatest missions in opening up this conversation is to pull back, I think, some of what I grew up with, which was a very sheltered white world that doesn't really understand what the problem is.
Right.
Jess, why are there protests?
Right.
Why can't these people just pull themselves up by their bootstraps like I did?
Yeah.
Air quotes probably should have been on that, because those are conversations that years and years ago that I've had, either in my head or with other people, that I've heard from my own upbringing. Hey, I didn't get any handouts.
Right.
Why is somebody else getting handouts for this?
Right. And that's what today we want to talk about, those things, and why it's just not as easy as it sounds.
Yeah, and again, you grew up in Spokane in a predominantly white world. You don't understand that. I don't understand that. And so that's part of the goal today. So what I want to do is jump into a little bit of what both of us learned and every real estate professional learned in the world of fair housing when you take your real estate courses and your real estate tests. 3 core concepts that at the time of reading them, I was like, wow, that's crap.
Yeah, who would do such a thing?
That's unbelievable. I'm sure glad that's behind us.
Yeah.
Man, some really bad people in the past. So let's talk about some of these terms. Steering. I'll just give you the definition. Influencing a buyer's choice of communities based on a protected class. So race, color, religion. That would be considered steering. So an example of, I'm going to hit the 3 main things and then we'll come back to examples. So block busting. Convincing white property owners to sell their house at lower prices, which they do by promoting fear in those house owners or homeowners that racial minorities will soon be moving into the neighborhood. Redlining, a discriminatory practice by which banks, insurance companies, etc. refuse or limit loans, mortgages, or insurance within specific geographic areas, especially inner city neighborhoods. So let's talk about steering. Steering is basically, you think of like steering a car. I'm going to direct someone to or away from some place, right. And it's specifically around those protected classes. So here's an example of how that practically happened in Spokane. This is from a Spokesman Review article on December 4th of 2016. We'll post a link to that in our Facebook. You can probably just Google it. Geraldine Williamson, who is the author of Spokane's African American History, tells a story of when she and her husband were looking to buy a home in the late 50s. A quote from that article: "They just won't show you certain properties," she said. Certain areas, certain properties, just, right. Sorry, we're not going to show you. Their first home was off of East Sprague. And then so that was in the late 50s, and then about a decade later, which would have been in the late 60s, they moved to a neighborhood in the Spokane Valley. They learned much later that the real estate company had approached the neighbors and asked them if it was okay to sell the home to a black family. What the hell? I mean, that's just... So, okay. Obviously, this is infuriating, but it still can feel like that was in the 60s, and right. It doesn't affect us today. So why make such a big deal out of it? Well, let's talk about block busting. So block busting would be pushing people out, or bad things are happening in this neighborhood, so you've right. got to sell now, and you probably should sell for cheap so you can get out of this area, specifically around racial minorities moving into the neighborhood. Redlining, that discriminatory, like, well, when I pictured it, because you just read about it in mortgage classes or real estate classes, is around, well, we aren't going to lend to certain people in this area. And I printed out a picture of Charlotte, of a map. So let's just talk about it. So in the 1930s, let's give some history and some context around it. So in the 1930s, economic relief and stimulus came to the United States through the New Deal. So this was Franklin Roosevelt, signed the National Housing Act into law on June 27th, 1934. The purpose of the law was to encourage improvements in housing standards and conditions. This was the creation of FHA. So we've right. talked in previous episodes about the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. This specific law created the Federal Housing Administration and the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. So it introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage, low fixed interest rates. The whole thing was created to stimulate growth within the real estate sector, because we all know that the real estate sector affects the economy at large. Right. And part of the big issue that was the Great Depression was a lack of home ownership, defaulting on loans and homes, and those kind of things that all fed into that. So this concept of FHA gave birth to what was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. And they created mapping tools for lenders as part of their appraisal process to determine loan risk.
Okay.
So it's a mapping system. I'm a lender. Part of my process to determine if I'm going to lend is the risk on this loan. How likely is this loan going to default? And so HOLC creates this mapping tool. So this is a copy of a map from Charlotte, North Carolina in 1935. And again, just Google it. I'll put it up on our Facebook page so you can see it. But it literally has a little legend here: prepared by Division of Research of Statistics, Appraisal Department, Homeowners Loan Corporation, May 15th, 1935 or 37 or something like that. And you can see, if you're looking at on our YouTube, or if you just look it up, I drew lines around it in the different sections, but they've got it broken up into 4 categories. You've got green, blue, yellow, and red. And they weren't lined. They were just, the whole sections were filled in. But for what I was putting together here, I just drew lines around it. So let's talk about the different colors, because this is what comes back to what has been referred to as redlining. I've been in the industry in some way for 18 years, and I didn't actually understand it until this week when we were preparing for this show. So green, best area, best people. Business class individuals, more than likely. Blue, good people, kind of blue collar individuals. Yellow, a declining area, more working class families. And then red, detrimental influences or hazardous, foreign born people, low class whites, and Negroes. Like these were all categorizations that were being put into the analysis by the HOLC as to determining this. So if you look into it and you start watching different YouTube videos or articles that have been written in the HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for red line neighborhoods was the presence of black and brown people. Now, reality is the studies show that people that lived in those red line areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it nearly impossible for people to buy or refinance in those neighborhoods, right? Because the banks now are using the map and they're saying, "Oh, you're in the red district. Well, we don't lend to it's too high risk. Like we don't want the default, so we're not going to lend in that red district." So what happens is now landlords begin to abandon their properties. City services become unreliable. In most places, crime increases and property values drop. And so why does that happen? Well, just we have to zoom out for a second and think about it. If I'm a landlord and I've got a property in a red zone and I need a new roof on my rental house, I'm not going to necessarily have $10,000 right now that I can drop into buying or putting a roof on my rental house. So I'm going to go to the bank. I'm going to say, "Hey, can I get a line of credit on this house so I can put a roof on it?" And the bank's going to start the loan application. And this guy's got all this, he's cash flowing, probably can pay this back. And oh crap, this is in a red zone. I'm sorry, we don't lend in the red zones because there's too many detrimental influences and hazards in that area. And so I'm sorry, we're going to have to decline your loan.
Okay.
What am I supposed... I got a leaky roof on my rental house.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do? I either just let it go to hell.
Right.
And just like, sorry, you have to deal with it, tenant, because I can't afford to do this. And a lot of landlords then began to abandon their properties because they couldn't do any improvements on it. The values started going down because people weren't getting loans in that neighborhood, so they weren't buying.
And it also goes for anyone that did get a loan in that neighborhood or somehow had it. As homeowners, they couldn't fix their roof either.
Absolutely. So these red areas now become declining areas, and it creates this feedback loop, right? So I'm an audio person. Like I do audio sound. Feedback is an audio term, and feedback is when sound from a speaker goes into a microphone, which then comes back out of the speaker and goes into the microphone, and it creates this loop. And the reality around, and most of us have heard feedback, is that it starts low and it grows, and then it just gets out of control because it creates this loop. And the only way you can stop the feedback is you got to shut that out. You got to close the channel and stop the feedback. So this becomes like a feedback loop for these redlined areas because it festers for like 30 years. So this is 1937 to 1968 is when this like redline zone is. For 30 freaking years, this is happening. White people are fleeing to the suburbs, many of which have covenants that explicitly exclude or forbid selling homes to black people.
That's right.
Like you just read.
Yeah.
So I'm a black individual that has income, that has reasonable credit, and I'm in this deteriorating neighborhood because nobody can get loans to fix their house. People are not wanting to be there anymore. Yeah. I can't even get out of this place.
Yeah.
So it causes lower home ownership. I'm just going to go back to the feedback loop real quick. Causes lower home ownership. Why? Because who the hell has enough cash to buy a house, right? If you can't get a loan, you're not buying a house. Businesses are less likely to open, and those that fail aren't replaced because, and as we're learning in the midst of all this COVID stuff, like if you can't get loans or you don't have cash flow, you're not operating.
Yeah.
This lowers available services, so banks aren't available for me, healthcare is not as available for me, retail merchandise and even my grocery stores aren't available for me. So it just just builds upon itself. So this then leads to a lack of unemployment because businesses aren't going to locate there, and a lack of employment is going to lead to now more crime.
Sure.
Because I can't work.
Sure, people get desperate.
Now it leads to a lower likelihood of investment in that neighborhood, which in turn appears to justify the redlining practice to begin with, because now people can point to it and say, oh, well, see, we told you that this neighborhood was bad.
But the circumstance in which was set up, the system in which was set up, created the problem in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think then that it creates this. So this then comes back to this mental conversation that white America has with themselves of, well, that was in the 30s,
right,
or that was in the 60s.
Sure.
And the reality is you have to like zoom out and say, well, how has this affected the wealth of Black America?
Right.
Because home ownership is the major way that Americans create wealth, and redlining is the reason why Black families only have a fraction of the wealth that white families do, even those white families with lower education and lower incomes, because for almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers.
I want to read something that fits with this. The Survey of Consumer Finances shows that the average homeowner has household wealth of $231,420, while the average renter's household wealth is $5,200. That is
so if you can't buy a house, your household wealth is a fraction.
Fraction. I didn't do the math, but it is a fraction.
You do the math out there. 5,200 versus 231,000.
That's right. So housing is paramount to the accumulation of wealth. And when I say wealth, I'm not talking about mega wealth here. I'm talking about just average wealth. I'm talking about the kind of wealth that makes you feel secure and take your family out to dinner 1 to 4 times a month. That's the kind of wealth we're talking about here. This is not a millionaire.
Yeah. And if you look at it, so this is evonomics.com is where I got this statistic. 60% of household wealth is inherited. 33% of the Forbes 400 billionaires inherited all or part of their wealth. So the fact that from the 30s on, and my God, I mean, this is a problem that's gone back a hell of a lot longer behind us than the 30s. I mean, this is hundreds of years. But if you just look at this one situation, is that there's no, if that many people are unable to buy a home, they're not able to transfer anything to their children or even to themselves. I mean, how many of us out there bought our first starter house, watched our wealth grow so that we could then buy our move-up home, so that we could then buy the bigger house for our family in the suburbs, and then we could sell that house and downsize and have a nest egg for our retirement. Man,
that's just so...
How much... I mean, it's just... Sorry, you don't get to buy a house because A, you can't live in the green neighborhood where we'll give you the loan.
Right.
And B, we won't give you the loan in the red neighborhood where we'll let you live.
Right. So you have to rent for the rest of your life.
And then let's talk about another feedback loop that I think is really, really important, and it has to do with schools. I kind of let the cat out of my bag here a little bit early. I was going to ask you a question. What is one of the first things that people, especially people that have or plan to start a family, put in their search for a neighborhood?
Good schools.
Good schools? That's important?
Yep.
That's not bad.
And it doesn't feel like you're being racist when you do that.
It's not, and it's not a bad thing to want to do the best for your kids, but what are people willing to do to get into a good school district?
Pay a higher mortgage.
Pay more money for their house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pay a little bit more every month so I can get into a good school district. Do you know how schools are funded? I know you do.
Property taxes.
Property taxes. How are property taxes calculated?
Value of your home.
Value of your home. Okay, so if people pay more money for homes in a neighborhood that have good schools. Those schools are going to get more funding from the taxes that are paid on those houses, which in turn gives them more resources, making them more desirable, increasing the values of the houses that people are willing to pay to get into the better school district. That gives them more resources, that increases the value of houses, and now we have a feedback loop that's positive.
Right.
But the opposite is true for those that don't have good schools or have mediocre schools, right, according to test scores or whatever that might be. People are going to pay less. Mm-hmm. Schools are going to have lower amount of resources, pushing people to look either to other places, lowering demand in that neighborhood, then reducing the value, lower resources for those schools, and the loop continues, the feedback loop continues. And now you come back to that conversation of, well, why can't they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps like I did? Mm-hmm. Because you lived in an area and grew up with an education that they didn't get to have because they were stuck in a feedback loop that was going the wrong direction.
That's right. Yeah. Let that sink in. This is a lot.
It's a big problem that the issue is that the actions of our grandparents in the 30s are jacking everybody up today.
They're still affecting us. They are still part of the DNA of people's lives.
And you wonder why people are breaking windows and graffitiing walls in our present state. They don't just feel trapped, they've been trapped.
Yeah. For sure. So let's talk a little bit more about the CCNRs. I've collected myself. I'm sorry for the crying at the beginning of this. It's a very emotional situation, and it's a very emotional subject. But we are here to try and educate not just you, but to educate ourselves. By doing this, it helps us to let it go deeper. So let's talk about the CCNRs. The one I read to you, and let's read it again, and I'm going to try and do better this time. No person of any race other than the white or Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by a domestic servant or a different race domiciled. So I can have my black maid live with me, but under no circumstances may she buy a house in my neighborhood or build a house, in this case, in my neighborhood. These same types of CCNRs can be found all over Spokane, including neighborhoods like Comstock, High Drive, Audubon, and places in the Spokane Valley. So none of us are immune from this. In fact, Spokane has over 30 of these provisions in plats and subdivisions all over. And we talked about housing and how important housing is to accumulate wealth. And we've talked about how we pass those things on. Even if we're not passing $1 million on to our children, we're passing on a lot of times a house that doesn't have a mortgage anymore, and that the kids get to split up and they get to, what did my mom do with her? She built a pool. She has a pool in her backyard.
Oh, did that increase the value of her home?
It increased the value of her home. And it also provided a place for her grandchildren to come and to be together and to...
I think it's a conversation of equity, because if we're not all on the same playing field when only some of us get to own real estate, because real estate values track with the economy.
That's right.
So when we're talking about accumulation of wealth, I want to come back to the fact this isn't about becoming a superstar, super rich person. No. It's like tracking with the general wealth of our nation. The gross domestic product of our nation is driven first and foremost by the real estate economy.
Value. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about how we got here. Matt went into those three terms: steering, block busting, and redlining, which are a huge part of why we're here today. But I want to start actually in 1917, because now we know that housing discrimination was rampant before this time. I mean, ridiculously so. But something happened in 1917 that sadly did not go far enough in opening doors for Black Americans to own homes. In 1917, the Supreme Court made it illegal for the government to discriminate based on your race. Wow.
Yay!
Yay! But they left the door open to allow property owners to discriminate through these covenants. And they were put in all kinds of covenants all over the United States. In 1948, the Supreme Court finally rules that these types of CC&Rs were illegal. Boom! 31 years later, all of those CC&Rs failed to exist, right? Like they went away, you couldn't put them in. Incorrect. Many of the 30 CC&Rs that we find in Spokane today in our history were written and implemented after 1948, after it was illegal. And they continued to enforce them, the ones that were written before that. The one that we talked about was written in 1947, right before this law went into effect.
Just snuck that one in.
They snuck that one in. So let's talk about the Federal Housing Authority, right? The ones that are supposed to protect us. From 1930 to 1960, the Federal Housing Authority, also known as HUD, so we all know what this is, right? Had these printed guidelines. They weren't hiding this, guys. This was not in some back memo. These are in their printed guidelines. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
So this was literally underwriting guidelines.
That is correct.
That were promoted by the FHA to the lenders. And it would have tied in with our map, right? From the 30s to the 60s.
Yep.
They're saying, and that's why if you go and you look at it, consistently the main reason for the red communities, the red-lined communities, was the presence of Black and brown persons.
That's correct. And think about this. We've said the reason why they couldn't move into the green areas was CC&Rs. Even if the CC&R didn't exist, this says that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. They were not going to be able to buy that, even if that CC&R did not exist. This is the HUD we're talking about. These are the people that are supposed to be expanding opportunity, but instead they're limiting it. 1950s. In the 1950s, Carl Maxey, who was a prominent Black attorney here in Spokane, had an open public debate over segregation. Do you want to know who was on the other side of that debate? A real estate agent. A real estate agent. Which for me is pretty tough because I'm a real estate agent and I identify that is my profession. And the idea that someone in my profession was arguing over segregation, it's difficult. I want to tell another story. In the 1980s, again, this is in Spokane. So this one, Carl Maxey, Spokane. This story, Spokane. In the 1980s, there's a woman, her name is Sandra Williams. Sandra Williams, I have discovered, is the founder, and I think she's still the editor of Black Lens News here in Spokane. Could be a good place for you to get some more education. But she was doing a class for the fair housing here in Spokane, and she told a story. And she was called by fair housing and said, hey, we believe that there is a landlord that is using discriminatory practices, and we need to test it out, because that's one of the things that fair housing does, is that they test real estate professionals, landlords, to make sure that they're being fair and that they're following the laws of the land. So she said she was super nervous, so she had to pretend that she was going to rent an apartment. She said she walked up to the door, and she said she was terrified that she was going to be met by this big, mean man that was going to, say mean things to her and call her names. And she said the door opened, and there was this lovely, and she described it, soccer mom. And they stood at the door and they chatted for about 10 minutes. I mean, just having a wonderful conversation. And when she asked if she could rent a place, she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We're totally full, very kind." And she went away from that interaction going, they have got this all wrong. So she called in, she made the report, she told them, this, I'm pretty sure you have this wrong. This lady is super nice. This is, not a situation. She called back a couple days later and said, what happened here? They said, we sent in the white person who had almost the same exact story and background as you, the story that we gave you, and they offered her an apartment on the spot.
Oh my God.
And this woman, it was like her world as a Black American fell apart. She just said, I could not believe in Spokane in the 1980s that this was still happening. She has some wonderful quotes, and I want to quote them here. She said, education, transportation, healthy food, health care, access to credit, living wage jobs, and wealth are all adversely affected if housing is insecure. Here's another one. Despite the best intentions of the Fair Housing Act, there's still discrimination. Some of it is explicit, some of it is implicit. It was policies that got us here. It wasn't just bad people doing bad things. It was governmental policies, and it's going to take policies to get us out.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is powerful, and it's in the 1980s. I have one more. Go ahead.
Well, before we go into some of your other examples, let's take a quick break.
Okay.
Welcome back, Spokane. If you're just joining us, this is EvoReal Talks, and today we are unpacking the issue of fair housing. If you weren't with us earlier, we've been talking about some of the fair housing issues, from steering and blockbusting to redlining. These were they were systematic processes and things that were going on in the 1930s all the way through the 1960s. And basically what we're talking about is inequities of housing wealth and opportunity, from homeownership to schools and education, and not just historically, but how it's actually affecting us today.
Yeah. And normally we do have a 30-minute program, but we asked the station if we could do a longer program because there is a lot of information and there are a lot of things to try and understand when it comes to housing and discrimination. And just for a minute, we want to kind of talk about, we're not here to point fingers at anybody else. We're here pointing fingers at ourselves, at our industry. I want to kind of talk a little bit about fair housing. Fair housing, as someone who owns a real estate company, we talk about fair housing a lot, and we talk about it, the things that we can do to make sure our behaviors line up with the Fair Housing Act that was enacted in 1968, which, by the way, steering, blockbusting, and redlining are all practices that are explicitly prohibited in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But those things didn't just stop in 1968. And so, as a real estate professional, we've had to put into all of our education about these things and how to not do them.
Right.
And
in your story before we went to break, just as an example,
right,
from 1980,
right,
a very obvious discriminatory act.
Correct.
Just because it's against the law doesn't mean people don't do it.
That's right. And there have been times when I've been in conversations with people and I will do it myself. Is like, how do I just make sure that I don't get in trouble? Mm-hmm. I just don't want to get in trouble by fair housing. Rather than understanding the heart of the Fair Housing Act. I mean, every month, every year, there is a month of the year that real estate professionals dedicate to fair housing. And it just becomes very kind of wrote, like, okay, let's not forget fair housing, and here are the things that you can't say, and here's the things that you, and it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to back up here for a second and figure out what the heart of the Fair Housing Act is, to try and understand how we may be complicit in it without even trying. And I think that that's an important piece, because again, when it comes to things, and I am guilty of this, wanting good schools for my kids, wanting to be in a good neighborhood. These are dangerous ways that we talk as a society. And it has caused continual divide between the haves and the have-nots.
Well, and I think that's that's what's happening in our society right now, is people standing up saying there has to be change, because it's not just about the awareness of fair housing and not getting in trouble or doing things that don't discriminate against other individuals, because that's just like a par. And I think that's what we were exploring earlier, is we can't just keep it on par, because at this point there's been such an inequity that's been created. Because if everybody from the 1960s on was on a similar trajectory, there's still 30 years of inequity.
Well,
that is
tried 300 years of inequity.
Yeah, fair. I mean,
we've kind of started here in the 1900s, but it's like it reminds me of the Titanic. The Titanic, when they were coming up on that glacier, looked like kind of a small glacier. Most of that glacier was under the water. So if we look at an
iceberg, we just have to correct that.
Oh, iceberg. Sorry.
The iceberg they were coming up on.
Thank you. It was the underneath stuff, right? That was the big stuff. And I think that what we're doing right now is we're looking at the surface of the water and everything that has come after that. So if we talk about the inequities that have been around for hundreds of years, and that's why we're
trying to unpack it for those of us that grew up in a white middle-class world.
Yes.
And if you're in Spokane and you grew up in Spokane, I'm sorry, get over it, but you did. Because what is the stat? Like 80% of Spokane is white? Or
I don't
more?
know the exact statistic, but it's
Google
a lot.
It. The point being is, you grew up in white America, and you just don't get it. I don't get it. I say you, and please know that when I say that, I'm speaking to myself, because that's how I grew up, in a very comfortable, privileged world. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for my parents, and I'm grateful for all of the benefits and privilege that I've had. But the challenge in this moment in history, and I truly believe that this is a moment in history, is those of us that grew up in the midst of white privilege have to take some action.
Right.
Because if we don't, we have to.
We do. One of the signs that was at the protest here in Spokane was, privilege is thinking that there's not a problem because it doesn't affect you. And I think that we are shining the light on our own hearts and our own lives and our own profession to say there is a problem here and we want to understand it. And so I'm hoping for those of you who are tuning in the radio and you're now just coming on this and you're going, what in the world is going on? Please, find our Facebook page and listen to the first half of this, and because we talk about CCNRs in Spokane that prevented anyone but white and Caucasians to purchase homes in at least 30 subdivisions in Spokane, and we're talking about practices and situations that have happened that have created this inequity over the years.
And I just to reiterate, is there the phrase, the comments that I have heard, that I have played in my own head. Well, we all live in a free country, and everybody has the same opportunity because we have the free country to live in. And I think, again, that comes from a perspective of privilege.
Yeah.
And that is part of what I want to at least unpack today, is if that's playing in your head, it's perhaps time to listen to a different perspective on how maybe we aren't all starting from the same playing field and with the same opportunity. And that just because we all live in the United States doesn't mean that the color of your skin doesn't still today change the level of opportunity that you have.
So, and I think this is also important. Just because you have black friends, a black best friend, grew up in an area where you were integrated, it does not mean that you're not part of a system that has hurt our black brothers and sisters and that we can't do something about it. I would like to tell a story. In 1961, there was a Spokane business owner. His name was Frank Hopkins. And he was interviewed by the Spokesman Review. By the way, we've gotten a lot of our good information from the Spokesman Review. They've got archives of this, of their interviews with people. It's been a wonderful resource. Thank you, Spokesman Review. So he was being interviewed by the Spokesman Review. And there was a reason he was being interviewed by the Spokesman Review. It was because he had purchased a home. And he had purchased a home outside of what would be considered the traditional black neighborhood. So he had purchased a home in a white neighborhood, basically. And before he moved in, he discovered that all 28 of his windows had been broken. For a second, I want you to think about this. If you're a real estate professional, I want you to think about this. If you're a homeowner, I want you to think about this. I work with homeowners every day. Every day of the week, I am talking to someone who either is a homeowner or is hoping to be a homeowner. And right now, at this moment, I am working with 2 first-time home buyers. And I took the time to think about this situation. One of my homeowners is going to close their house, their first home, in about 2 weeks. And if in 2 weeks, when they were getting ready to move into their home, they found that all of their windows had been broken out, how would they feel? How would you feel?
How would they deal with it? Like, now I've got money outlay.
That's right. I'll tell you, it would not only make me mad, it would make me feel incredibly unsafe. And it would also, at the very top of this whole situation here, financially, it could devastate you. It would devastate my clients. They've just spent all their money to purchase this home, and now they have to replace all the windows. And do you know what Mr. Hopkins' response was? He said, "I just had to let it go. I just had to let it go." Can you imagine any of us saying that? No, because we would believe that we could get justice. And Mr. Hopkins knew that he would get none, that there would be no justice for him. So you might be saying, "Yes, Jessica, but that was just your history. You're talking about history. You're talking about 1917. You're talking about the 1930s. You're talking about 1950. You're talking about 1961. You're talking about the 1980s. That was a long time ago. But let's not forget how close these events really were. This incident with the broken windows was only 13 years before I was born. 13 years. This was in 1961. How old are you? How old are your parents or your grandparents? What year were they born in? And what event that we've talked about was part of their life and in their lifetime? This man's children can't really be much older than me. These are events that we can reach out and touch right now. Mm-hmm. And I want to kind of finish out today's show with some closing thoughts for us as citizens, and specifically as white citizens. I saw a picture today of one of the protests. It wasn't one of the ones in Spokane, but it's very possible that this was a sign in Spokane as well. And it was a white man with his child on his shoulders. And he held a sign, and the sign said, "I will do better." And I'm going to take that because all of this information that I'm giving you right now could just feel overwhelming. It is overwhelming for me. I have choked up many times as I have been writing this. I have choked up many times as I've tried to record this. And so you might be feeling overwhelmed. What do I do?
Yeah, I think it absolutely feels like an insurmountable.
It does. It does. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to, don't go ahead.
It feels insurmountable to me. And on some level, it doesn't affect me personally. I can't imagine how people of color look at this and try to tackle it and take one little bite at a time, hoping and believing that the next generation won't be in the same place that they are.
That's right. Whew, it's heavy. It's heavy, and it's okay to let it sink in. It's okay to sit in this and feel that pain.
That's so important that you said that. I think one of the most impacting interviews that I heard was from a lady that's covered these type of things a lot over the years, and she said, "I just feel like I have to sit in this and be present with it." Mm-hmm. And that is a start point. Like, the tendency would be to just shut this off, move on to something else and feel better.
Yep.
But to kind of just sit and be present.
It is. It's important. And I don't want you to feel like there's nothing you can do, because there are things you can do. And I'm going to use, so the sign again was, "I will learn to do better." And it was a white man holding that sign. And so I want to use these words to help us with our next steps. So the first line, "I will." I will. Not my husband, not my mayor, not my children. Maybe your children are very active in this. Or the people across town, or the politicians in Washington, D.C. I will. I know we didn't create all of these policies and systems that are now etched into the foundation of our nation. But we live on those foundations now. And we are each responsible for what we build or what we tear down, because there are certainly things that need to be torn down as well as being built. I will learn. Learn. It's pretty simple. Let's just learn. Let's not be ignorant to why we are here, which is, honestly, that is our start place. Matt and I, we had the choice of doing just a regular show where we talk about numbers and we talk about the real estate. And we said, no, we have to learn. And one of the best ways to learn is to learn it well enough to teach other people. I mean, I've learned that in my own real estate business. So we need to not be ignorant as to why we're here. Let's educate ourselves with books. I actually like audiobooks, podcasts, listening to speakers on YouTube, finding places where they want to educate you, and talking to other people of color in our nation, in our lives. We can't be colorblind anymore. We need to have our eyes wide open to the past, the present, and the future. To be colorblind is to miss out on understanding that people with black and brown skins have had it harder in our country than white Caucasians. Let's learn. I will learn to do. Do, take action. Get involved. Donate. Volunteer. Vote. Get involved means use your influence to affect policy changes, policy decisions in schools, organizations, politics. Donate. Donate to and volunteer for organizations that strive to make a difference. Vote. Let your voice be heard. Vote for candidates that recognize faulty systems and are ready to enact change through legislation. I will do better. The last word is the word better. Let's make a determination that we will do better. We will do better than our ancestors, and we will do better than our past selves. let's recognize our own racist thoughts and reactions, because guess what? We all have them. I'm reading a book right now. It's called How to Be Anti-Racist by, I believe I'm saying this correctly, Ibram X. Kendi. Hopefully that is correct. The author...
We'll post a link on our
Sure.
Facebook so that they can just click.
The author explains and defines anti-racism, and it was so helpful for me. I went for a walk the other day. I'm listening to it, and here is what he said. He said, racist or anti-racist is not who you are. It is what you do. So one minute, I could be 100% anti-racist, and then the next, I could be racist. And recognizing that in ourselves is going to make us better. Because if we just put ourselves in the category of I'm anti-racist, then we could be blind to the things that we do that potentially make us racist, right? And that is revelatory. So again, I want to say it again. It is not who you are, it is what you do. And by recognizing that we can love our black brothers and sisters and still do, say, and believe things that are racist, by recognizing this, we recognize that we can do better. For me to recognize that there may be ways that I have been looking at real estate, that I have been looking at where people live, and that maybe some of those thoughts and ideas are racist, is the only way that I can get better, and is the only way that we as a society can get better. As individuals, as families, and as participants in the system that is the United States of America, we can learn to do better. And we can learn to do better, Spokane. I want to thank everybody for being with us today. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, you are free to send it to us. You can send it to ask@everreal.com. We have a Facebook page. We will be posting some of the materials that we have here, links to some of these articles. And let's continue the dialogue. Let's not let this fall to the ground because this week is an intense week when it comes to race in the United States. Let's let this go deep, and let's make the changes that will create equity. Let's create equity. And that is such a housing word. And I want to see it in our socially creating equity, financially creating equity. It's important.
It's important. Thanks for listening, Spokane. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.